Well, good evening. I'm going to start a new session here since I forgot to record the other one earlier when I was working with the 4-Hers to show how to solder on our printed circuit board, or our series and parallel circuit board, I should say. And so I'm going to share this with you here, and we're going to talk about the soldering process and how to solder your board and the materials that are used. So join with me here in the other camera, and we'll take a swing over there and show you how that's done to solder up your board. Okay. Turn down my sound over here. So on our circuit board here, we've got some connections that we've got to solder. We've got to solder each of the connections on the light socket and the two on the battery holder. We do not need to solder the ones on the switch because they do have screws that tighten down for the wires there, so we don't need to do any soldering on there. So the materials that I'm using here, I'm using a soldering iron, and this is a pencil style here. I've got a tip cleaner here. It's a wire, like a Brillo pad, but it's a brass pad that I can poke my tip into the pad to clean the tip, or I can drag the tip over the edge, and that wipes off all the crud off of the tip. And just to talk about my soldering iron here a little bit, this soldering iron has been pre-tinned. You can see this is nice and shiny here. When I touch my solder there, you can see the solder sticks to the tip and it retins the tip. And so that's going to give us the tin tip, and that will give us that nice tip to transfer the heat to the solder connection that we're trying to solder. And then the solder that I'm using is a rosin core. It's an electronic solder. My solder happens to be 60-40, so it's 60% tin, 40% lead. Lead is a poison to our body, so when you're working with this product, we don't want to inhale the fumes. And then also when we're done, you want to wash your hands. The lead is poisonous to us if we ingest it in our body, so if we wash it off of our hands, we should be fine, and take care to do that. Also, you'll want to make sure and wear some safety glasses while you're soldering to protect your eyes. This does have a rosin core in the center of it. It's kind of like a straw, and sometimes that little rosin will splatter a little bit. You may feel it on your skin. It should not hurt you. It might be a little bit hot when it lands, but don't let that scare you. And most of the time, the rosin is not going to splatter out and get on you. The solder is also a 0.031 inch, so a 31 thousandths of an inch solder. So this is a very small solder, and that gives me a good control about the volume, or how much solder to put on our connections here. So I'm going to talk through our process first, and then I'm going to show you and demonstrate how to do the soldering. You can lay your solder, your board down like this and solder, but it may be a little bit easier for you to actually stand it up and kind of help the gravity help get the solder where it needs to be. Solder always wants to go where the heat is on the board. So if you heat up the connection, the solder will want to go there. But if you put the solder on the connection here, gravity will also try to pull it down a little bit, and it may run down more like a teardrop, and especially if you get too much solder on there, it would run. So I suggest to turn your board up and kind of use the direction of gravity to help you on getting that in there. So in order to solder, what we want to do is you'll want to clean your tip each time to be able to clean the tip off. We're going to retin the tip by putting the solder and touching the solder onto the tip. That will give us a nice molten heat transfer of heat from the iron to the connection. Then we're going to put our soldering iron and touch both the wire and the terminal that we're trying to solder. We're going to heat those both up to the same temperature. We're going to add some solder. We're going to remove the solder, and then we're going to remove our iron, okay? So about that speed. So we're going to clean our tip in the tip cleaner. We're going to retin the soldering iron, and I'll do one with the board laying down, and so you can see that. We're going to touch that both to the metal wire in the connection. We're going to add solder to that, remove the solder, and remove the iron. So let's go through that one more time. Clean the tip, retin the tip, touch our connection. We're going to touch the solder onto the hot connection, not the hot iron. And you can see the solder starting to melt. Remove the solder, remove the iron. And there we have a nice soldered connection. And let me zoom in on that so you can see that a little bit. Okay, now let me turn my solder, you can see that there, but let me turn my board up and do a solder on the back side here of that connection so you can kind of see that. Okay, so I'm going to clean my tip in the iron cleaner, in the tip cleaner. I'm going to retin my tip. Going to lay that hot tip so I touch both pieces of metal. Add a little bit of solder, remove the solder, remove the iron. Okay, and as you can see, now we've got a nice soldered connection there. It's bright and shiny. We want to be careful we didn't melt any of the insulation here, so we don't have any damage there. The judge is going to look for that. Okay, and this one happened to fill up the little hole where the wire was, so you can see the hole is filled up, but that's not necessary to fill up the hole, but it probably will fill up with your volume of solder that you have. So if you have a little bit of solder, and we'll look at these. See, I've soldered those a little bit, and this one I soldered with the board sitting down, so you can see where the solder dripped a little bit or went down where that wire was. And the other one here looks really nice where it did not fill in the hole, but it is covering all of the wire, okay? And again, we don't want to melt any insulation or have any damage there. So let's take a look at our connections here on the back. You can see this one here didn't get very good coverage on the back, so I might want to add a little bit more solder here. And this one has nice coverage over here on this one, so that one looks nice. And here's a couple more that we've put down. So this one has really nice coverage here on that wire. And then this one is just fine. And it has just the right amount there. And you can see I started to melt the insulation just a little bit because my insulation is probably a little bit too close on that connection there, okay? So we want to be careful not to melt that insulation. Let me turn that around to the front here. And you can see here on that white wire, where that white wire is nice. It has not melted or it didn't burn the insulation. And the bare wire is up to the terminal, but not too far away or not too close either. So we want to have the judge look at that when we're judging, and he will judge or she will take a look at that and see what your connection looks like. Okay, so I've got one more solder connection here to do, and I'll work on this one here. I'll turn this one up and I'll solder this one so we can take one more look at the soldering process. So I've got my iron here in my hand. I'm going to clean the tip. Let me move that so you can see. Okay, so I'm going to clean the tip of my iron by poking it there in the tip cleaner. And let me move that out of the way. Okay, I'm going to retin my tip by touching the solder, and this is the only time that we touch the solder to the iron. And I'm going to touch the hot iron onto both pieces of metal. I'm going to touch that connection, hot connection with my solder, pull the solder away, pull the soldering iron away. And we don't have to be in a rush. If you want to add some more solder, it's easy. We just go back and heat up the connection, and we can add a little bit more solder. it's always easier to add solder than it is to remove. If we need to remove solder, I'll show you some tools here that we have for that. One of the tools to remove solder is called a solder pump or a desoldering pump. And what this is a spring-loaded vacuum pump, and we heat up the solder connection, and then we press this button, and it creates a vacuum and sucks up the solder through the nozzle. Okay, so that tool would remove solder. The other tool that we have to remove solder is desoldering braid, and it comes on a little wheel like this. It's a copper braid, and I've used this one, so you can see it's typically just a bare copper piece of wire that's a little fine braided wire, and you put this onto the connection where you want to remove the solder, and you put your iron on top of this braid, and the solder is wicked into the braid here, and that. So that's how that solder desoldering braid works, by moving that solder. Okay, so here on our one last thing for your here, we need to make sure and put a label. Mine is a series circuit that I built here, so that is the label that you need to put on the board. And you can decorate your board however you want. If you want to put your name on it, if you want to paint it, stain it, however you want to finish it out, that is just fine. It's your board. But the judge is going to look mainly at the electrical connections here and of the soldering and see how the electrical skills are. The only time that they would look at the project being mounted onto the board is they had every project that was identical, and they needed to have something to decide a winner for all the products, and then look at, did you decorate nicely? Did you finish it? You know, is neat appearance? Did you put extra on people?